Highway 9 through Denton County, South Georgia. At 1:45 in the morning is not a road so much as a corridor through the dark, and the dark out here is the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on the asphalt and absorbs everything. The occasional flash of a dead streetlight, the slow drift of pine resin through a cracked window, the particular silence of a place where there are no other people and no reason to be moving at this hour except that you are trying to get somewhere that matters. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb had been driving for 6 hours, and he would drive for 6 more if that's what it took. Because at the end of this road was Virginia, and in Virginia was a house with a light probably still on. And inside that house was a 7-year-old girl named Aaliyah, who had turned 7 while her father was 8,000 miles away doing things he was not allowed to talk about. And Marcus Webb had made himself a quiet, private promise somewhere over the Atlantic that he was going to be home before she woke up on Wednesday morning. His hands on the wheel were big hands, the kind of hands that had spent 2 decades doing real work, hauling gear over terrain that didn't forgive mistakes, climbing ropes in the dark, holding a teammate's weight when the teammate couldn't hold his own. The knuckles were scarred in small ways, and the right palm had a callus along the thumb base that would never fully go away. He rested them at 10 and 2 with the relaxed precision of a man whose body does competent things automatically because his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about the lion. It was in a Walmart bag on the back seat tucked against the door so it wouldn't slide, and he had bought it at a rest stop outside of Gainesville, Florida at 11 o'clock at night because it was the best option available, and because Aaliyah had told him back in October of last year that she wanted to be a lion for Halloween. He hadn't been there for Halloween either. He'd been on the front end of the deployment already in theater, but he had remembered, and he needed her to know that he had remembered, because there is a specific kind of damage that happens to a child when they begin to suspect their father keeps them in a separate drawer from the rest of his life, and Marcus Webb refused with everything he had to let his daughter grow up believing that about him. In the passenger seat, Petty Officer First Class Devin Carter was asleep against the window, his breath making small clouds on the glass that appeared and faded in a slow, steady rhythm. Devin's right shoulder was still healing from a training incident 3 weeks before the deployment ended. Nothing broken, but the kind of deep muscle damage that takes 4 months to stop announcing itself every time you reach for something, and because of that, Marcus had volunteered to drive the whole way, because that's what Marcus did quietly and without making it a thing. Devin had a legal pad on his lap face down because he'd been writing before he fell asleep. Nobody on base knew Devin Carter wrote R&B lyrics. He'd been doing it since he was 19, writing them for his mother, mostly sometimes for himself, occasionally for women who never knew a decorated Navy petty officer had lost sleep over them. The legal pad went everywhere he went, face down, because some things are private even between people who have trusted each other with their actual lives. Marcus checked the rearview mirror. Empty road behind them for as far as the headlights reached, which was not far. He checked it again 30 seconds later. He would check it again after that. It wasn't paranoia. It was a habit that 8 months in the Horn of Africa had pressed so deeply into his nervous system that it operated now the way breathing operated without his permission, without his awareness, just constantly and automatically. Devin stirred, didn't wake, made a small sound that was either the start of a sentence or the end of a dream. Marcus adjusted the heat by 1 degree and kept driving. He had rehearsed it the moment at the door in the way that men who are not good at speeches rehearse the things they know they have to say. 2 weeks of rehearsal in the back of transport vehicles and in the narrow bunk of the carrier and during the long layover in Norfolk. And he still didn't have it right because the truth of what he wanted to say to Keisha was not a speech. It was something more like an apology wrapped around a promise, wrapped around the specific exhaustion of a man who loves his family more than he can explain and keeps choosing a life that takes him away from them. And there is no clean way to say that at a front door at 5 in the morning. Keisha's voice on their last video call 3 weeks before the deployment ended had been tired in a way he recognized Not the tired of a bad day, but the accumulated tired of 8 months of doing everything alone, while also explaining to a 7-year-old why Daddy's face only existed on a small screen. She hadn't complained. She never complained. That was its own kind of weight. Aaliyah had asked him on that same call why he couldn't just come home. He'd given her the answer he always gave, the one about duty and service and how much it mattered. And she had nodded with the patient, slightly disappointed nod of a child who has heard this answer before and has decided to accept it even though she doesn't fully believe it. That nod had stayed with him across 8 months and 2 oceans. That nod was why the lion was in the Walmart bag on the back seat instead of arriving by mail, or worse, not arriving at all. Devin woke up somewhere south of Macon, lifting his head from the window and blinking at the dark highway with the immediate alertness of someone whose body knows how to come fully online in a single second. He looked at the Walmart bag on the back seat, then at Marcus with the unhurried comprehension of a man who had known Marcus Webb for 4 years and understood most of his silences without needing them explained. "She's going to love it," Devin said, his voice still carrying the rough edge of sleep. Marcus didn't answer right away. He watched the road for a moment, the white dashes disappearing under the hood one after another. Then he said quietly that he hoped she'd let him be there when she named it, that he'd missed enough already. Devin nodded and said nothing more because there was nothing more useful to say, and Devin Carter understood the difference between what needed words and what didn't. He turned back to the window. After a moment, he picked up the legal pad from his lap and started writing. Marcus checked the gas gauge. 3/4. They were fine. He checked the time, 2:08 a.m. They'd be in Virginia before sunrise. He rolled his window down an inch, let in the pine-cold air with its faint smell of red clay and distant water, and let himself just for that moment believe that everything was going to be exactly fine. Deputy Clint Mercer of the Denton County Sheriff's Department had been parked behind the same billboard for 40 minutes, and the billboard advertised a personal injury law firm. And the irony of that was the kind of irony that Mercer had never noticed once in 15 years of parking in that exact spot. Because Clint Mercer was not a man given to self-reflection. He was 43 thick through the gut, in the way that happens when a man stops caring about the physical standard he was once required to maintain, and his uniform fit him the way a tent fits a piece of furniture technically containing the thing, but not designed for it. There was a coffee stain on his left cuff from this morning that he hadn't bothered to address, and his hair needed cutting by about 2 weeks. None of this troubled him because in Denton County at 2 a.m. there was nobody to impress and nothing to prove, except the one thing he came here every week to prove. In his center console, wedged between a pack of antacids and a flashlight that needed new batteries, was a small spiral notebook. In it, in Clint Mercer's own handwriting, was a column of entries, not case numbers, not crime descriptions, but dollar amounts next to dates. The most recent entry was 4 days ago, $3,200, next to a description of a couple driving back from a Cherokee County casino next to the word cooperated. He had given them a receipt for $400. The other $2,800 had traveled through channels that were not the county evidence room. He had been doing this for 11 years. Not the whole 15. There had been a version of Clint Mercer back in the beginning who had genuinely wanted to do the job right. That version had lasted about 4 years before the county's funding cuts and the department's quiet culture of extraction had shaped him into something more efficient and considerably less moral. He didn't think about that earlier version anymore. There was no percentage in it. His method was simple and, in the context of Denton County's legal architecture, essentially safe. He targeted rental cars with out-of-state plates, preferably late at night, preferably on isolated stretches of Highway 9, preferably with drivers who looked like they might be carrying cash or drugs or both. The stops were almost always profitable. The arrests were almost always unchallenged. Judge Whitfield set the bail the county seized the assets, and the terrified out-of-towners either made deals or fled back to wherever they came from and never returned. which was, from Mercer's perspective, the ideal outcome either way. When the black Tahoe with Virginia plates emerged from the dark, doing exactly 35 miles an hour, Mercer sat up before he'd consciously decided to. He watched it for a moment. The way it moved was deliberate, not the deliberateness of someone who'd noticed the patrol car, but the deliberateness of someone who simply drove carefully, which somehow bothered Mercer more than carelessness would have. He ran the plates automatically out of habit. Clean. Rental out of Norfolk. His hand moved to the light bar switch. The calculation that followed the one that decided he was going to pull this vehicle over took about 4 seconds and involved zero evidence of any crime. It involved the make and year of the vehicle, the late hour, the Virginia plates, and what Mercer could see of the 2 silhouettes in the front seats. He had dressed that calculation up in the language of law enforcement for so long that he couldn't have told you where the instinct ended and the bias began. He had stopped being able to tell the difference years ago. He pulled out from behind the billboard and fell in behind the Tahoe, his lights off, riding the bumper watching. He gave it 30 seconds. Then he hit the switch. Marcus saw the lights in the rearview mirror at 2:11 a.m. and felt before anything else the specific exhaustion of a man who has been through this before. Not fear, not surprise, just the weight of something familiar arriving at the worst possible time. Devon was already awake, head off the window, eyes alert in the instant way that military training builds into you whether you want it or not. "Lights," Devon said. "I see him." Everything Marcus did next was deliberate, documented in his own mind in the same way he documented tactical situations, because experience had taught him that the way a stop begins determines a great deal about how it ends, and he had survived enough situations to understand that preparation was not pessimism, it was survival. He engaged the turn signal while still moving. He decelerated smoothly without braking hard. He pulled fully onto the shoulder, not mostly onto it fully, and brought the Tahoe to a complete stop. Engine off, all 4 windows down despite the chill, dome light on. Both hands on top of the wheel, fingers spread and visible. Devon placed his hands flat on the dashboard without being told. They had done this before, both of them in places that had nothing to do with the military. They had been doing this version of the choreography since they were teenagers in different cities, learning the same terrible protocol, because the alternative was something they'd both seen happen to men they knew. The Walmart bag with the lion was visible on the back seat. Marcus noted it. He hoped whoever was approaching didn't touch it. Mercer's approach was itself a kind of communication. He came up on the passenger side, which forced Marcus to turn away from his own door and created a blind angle that was mildly disorienting, not enough to do anything, with just enough to keep a driver slightly off balance. His flashlight came on before he reached the window, and it went directly into Marcus's face and stayed there about 3 seconds longer than any protocol required. "License and registration," Mercer said. "Not good evening, not do you know why I stopped you. Just the command issued with the flat authority of a man who had never needed to be polite to get compliance." "Good evening, officer," Marcus said, keeping his voice at a calm conversational register that gave Mercer nothing to work with. "We were maintaining the speed limit. Could you tell me what the stop is for—" Mercer told him he'd swerved back there, crossed the yellow line. The lie came out smooth and complete and entirely unaccompanied by any physical tell, because Mercer had been telling this particular lie for years and it fit his mouth naturally now. Marcus said his license was in his wallet in his back right pocket, and his rental agreement was in the glove compartment, and asked permission to reach for them, narrating each movement before he made it. The extreme calm seemed to land on Mercer in an odd way. He'd been expecting the usual spectrum that ran from nervous compliance to angry resistance, and the absence of either created a friction he didn't have a name for. He snatched the documents, shone the light on the license, then on the 2 military common access cards that Marcus and Devon had included with their IDs. Both cards clean, both photos matching both ranks, printed in unambiguous military type. Mercer held them under the flashlight for a moment, then handed them back with a grunt, followed by a comment that arrived with a specific, practiced contempt. "Military boys always think that card means something special out here on the road. Doesn't change a thing about what I'm seeing, son." Marcus noted the comment, filed every word of it, said nothing. "Step out of the vehicle," Mercer said. Marcus asked calmly, and without any aggression at all, what the probable cause was for a vehicle exit order, since the stated reason for the stop was a traffic infraction that would normally result in a citation, and he wanted to make sure he understood the officer's legal basis before complying. Something changed in Mercer's face, not dramatically, but in the way of a man who has encountered something his toolkit wasn't built for. He was used to fear. He was not built for two men who looked at him the way these two men were looking at him, with complete attention and zero deference, as if they were assessing a problem rather than submitting to an authority. Devon spoke then, one sentence measured and entirely accurate under Fourth Amendment case law, and Mercer recognized the shape of it, even if he couldn't immediately counter it, and the fact that he recognized it and couldn't counter it made him angry in the specific, dangerous way that men get angry when they realize they've been outclassed in their own arena. He drew his weapon. Neither Marcus nor Devon flinched. They had looked down the barrels of weapons held by men with actual reasons to use them, and a sweating deputy on a Georgia highway barely moved the needle on their collective threat assessment. But they were disciplined, and the law was the law, and the footage, which Mercer did not yet know existed, was rolling. "Complying," Marcus said, and he opened the door with his left hand, stepping out slowly, hands raised. When Mercer grabbed Marcus by the shoulder and spun him face first into the side of the Tahoe, the metal was cold against Marcus's cheek, cold and gritty with road dust, and the impact was harder than it needed to be by a margin that was not accidental. Marcus felt it in his neck. He noted it precisely without drama filed for later. The handcuffs went on too tight. Marcus felt the steel edge against the bone of his wrist, felt the bite of the ratchet going one click beyond what was necessary, and understood that this was not carelessness, but a message about who had power here, delivered in the language of steel and delivered deliberately. Devon was cuffed on the passenger side with equal deliberate force. When the cold metal clicked around Devon's wrists, his first thought, specific and real, arriving fully formed, was about his grandmother's church hat and the photo of it on his phone screensaver, and whether she was going to see something about tonight on the news before he could call her. They were put on the grass by the ditch. The grass was wet and cold, soaking through Devon's jeans almost immediately. The night smelled like pine and mud and the faint exhaust of Mercer's cruiser idling 20 feet away. Then Mercer tore the Tahoe apart. He went through the bags with the energy of a man expecting to find something, then with the energy of a man who needs to find something, then with the energy of a man who is beginning to understand he is not going to find something. And that last energy is the most dangerous kind, because it is the energy of desperation, wearing the costume of authority. He pulled Marcus's duffel out and upended it onto the shoulder. Neatly folded civilian clothes, protein bars, a toiletry kit, and wrapped carefully in a gray long-sleeve shirt, a photograph of Aaliyah in her Halloween lion costume, grinning with a missing front tooth, photographed by Keisha and texted to Marcus's satellite phone in theater. Mercer didn't look at the photograph. He tossed the shirt aside, moved to Devon's bag, found Devon's legal pad, and rifled through it without reading it, found nothing of interest, threw it onto the wet ground. Nothing. No drugs, no cash, no weapons. Mercer walked to the front tire of the Tahoe. He put his back to Marcus and Devon. His hand went into his own cargo pocket. When he turned back around, there was a small plastic baggie in his fingers, a tiny crumpled thing containing a dusting of white powder. Marcus and Devon saw exactly what happened. They exchanged one look, brief and complete, the kind of communication that doesn't need language. They said nothing. Mercer held the baggie up under his flashlight with the performative satisfaction of a man who had done this before and knew how the next part went. He was already calculating the forfeiture value of the Tahoe, the bail number Whitfield would set, how quickly these two would decide that a plea deal was better than a trial in Denton County. He made two comments while walking back toward his cruiser to call for transport. The first was about their military IDs being about as useful as a library card once you crossed into his county. The second was quieter, almost to himself, the kind of thing a man says when he thinks the only people listening don't matter. "Nobody's coming to save you boys out here. Your commanding officer isn't going to drive down from Virginia for a couple of drug runners." Both comments were casual. Both were recorded with crystal-clear audio by the 4 flush-mounted cameras inside the Tahoe that Mercer had no idea existed syncing in real time to a naval special warfare server at a facility in Virginia whose address was not publicly listed. Devon watched the lights of a single passing 18-wheeler slow slightly as it approached the scene, then accelerate as it passed. Nobody stopped. It was the kind of road where people made that calculation quickly and didn't revisit it. Marcus looked up at the sky. It was clear, genuinely clear, the kind of clarity you only get far from city light, and the stars were the same stars he had looked at from the coast of Somalia. The same geometry of light scattered across the same darkness, completely indifferent to what was happening on the shoulder of Highway 9. The Tahoe was not a standard rental. It was a Department of Defense General Services Administration fleet vehicle registered under a shell lease agreement through a Virginia holding company outfitted for the use of personnel in units whose names did not appear in the public record. Behind the tinted rear panel were 4 compact camera housings covering 360 degrees of the vehicle's exterior motion, activated continuously, recording and uploading encrypted footage to a secure server in real time through a satellite uplink that did not depend on cell coverage. Every word Mercer had said on this highway was already uploaded. Every movement he had made was time-stamped and stored. The moment he reached into his own cargo pocket and turned back around with the baggie, that moment existed now in a form that no subsequent paperwork could alter and no Denton County judge could suppress. "Nobody's coming to save you boys out here. Your commanding officer isn't going to drive down from Virginia." The audience knew what was already moving in the dark 500 miles north. Mercer did not. The Denton County Sheriff's Department was a building that communicated something specific about the institution inside it. A one-story structure of buff-colored brick built in 1984 that had not been significantly updated since, and the accumulated years had given it a particular character. Fluorescent fixtures with one dead tube in 3 that flickered every 40 seconds. Linoleum floors worn through to the adhesive in the high traffic areas. The smell of burnt coffee and industrial cleaning solution, and something older underneath both of those things. The particular staleness of a place where the windows are never opened because the people inside have long since stopped noticing the air. Sergeant Dale Briggs was at the booking desk working a crossword, and he looked up with the unhurried boredom of a man who processed the arrival of human beings into his facility the way a machine processes input registered, logged, filed, done. He had been doing this job for 22 years. He had stopped seeing the people a long time ago. Marcus and Devon were walked through the lobby in handcuffs, and their posture in those handcuffs was the first thing that created a friction. Briggs couldn't quite categorize. They were straight-backed chins, level eyes, moving through the room with the calm assessment of people taking inventory, rather than the hunched defeat of people who had been broken, and there was a dissonance between the handcuffs and the way they carried themselves that Briggs's brain registered without his being able to name it. Mercer recited the charges with the casual fluency of a man reading from a memorized script resisting arrest assault on a peace officer felony possession. He added the assault charge without breaking rhythm, the way a man adds an item to a grocery list, automatic, unremarkable, structurally necessary to the story he was building. Briggs stamped the intake form. He did not look at Marcus or Devon while doing this. When Mercer pulled the CAC cards from Marcus's wallet and held them up for Briggs with theatrical skepticism, Briggs squinted at the federal seals and the clear military photographs and the ranks printed in clean, unambiguous type, and then he set them on the desk beside the intake form and went back to his crossword. He did not run them through the federal database. He did not call anyone. He had a 7-letter word to figure out, and these were Mercer's people, and Mercer's people were always fine. Devon's jaw tightened watching this. It was the only physical sign he gave of what he was feeling. Marcus beside him was completely still, not the stillness of a man suppressing emotion, but the stillness of a man doing something specific with his attention. And what he was doing was memorizing badge number name tag, the exact words used at booking the time on the institutional clock on the wall behind Briggs's head, the location of every camera visible in the room and the angle each one covered, and the critically important fact that Briggs had not run the CAC cards, which meant no federal notification had been triggered yet, which meant the clock was still running, which meant the phone call needed to happen soon. Marcus Webb was not in this moment a victim cataloging abuse. He was an operator cataloging a target. On the bulletin board behind Briggs's desk, among the shift schedules and the wanted posters, there was a photograph in a plastic sleeve Clint Mercer and Judge Gerald Whitfield at what appeared to be a county law enforcement appreciation dinner. Both men in their dress uniforms. Both men grinning at the camera with the comfortable ease of people who have known each other a long time and trust that the other one will keep his end of whatever arrangement exists between them. Through the open door of the processing room, visible from the booking desk at the right angle, was a filing cabinet with the drawer hanging open. Inside it were rows of civil asset forfeiture folders, packed in with the density of a system that produced this particular paperwork regularly enough to require dedicated storage. The sheer volume of them said something that no individual document in the collection could say alone. This was not a response to unusual criminal activity. It was a business producing predictable output on a reliable schedule, and the schedule had been running for a very long time. A second deputy walked through the lobby on his way to the break room, coffee mug in hand. He glanced at Marcus and Devon with an expression that was not cruelty and was not sympathy. It was the specific flatness of a man who has seen this precise scene enough times that it has become wallpaper, who has made his peace with what it means to be part of a department that operates this way, who has chosen every single workday not to ask the question that his glance suggested he somewhere still knew to ask. He poured his coffee and left without a word. Devon, being fingerprinted at the processing station, looked at the caseboard on the wall. There was an old arrest photo pinned to it, a young black man, early 20s, possession charge, plea down to time served. Devon didn't know this man. But he knew this man in the way you know people whose stories are versions of a story you've heard enough times that it lives in you somewhere, and looking at the photograph he felt something that was not anger and was not grief, but was related to both of them, and the feeling had a specific weight, because he understood now, standing in this building in handcuffs, that the distance between himself and that photograph was not as wide as he had always needed to believe. He turned away from the board. He thought about his grandmother's church hat, and then he pushed that thought down. Somewhere it wouldn't interfere with what needed to happen next. The holding cell was 8 feet by 10 feet cinder block painted the institutional green of a color chosen by someone who had never had to sit inside it, a single steel bench bolted to the wall, a toilet with no seat under a bare bulb behind a wire cage. It smelled of bleach trying to cover something older than bleach, and the concrete floor was cold in a way that came up through the soles of your shoes and settled in your knees. They were put in orange jumpsuits. The fabric was rough and slightly too large in the way that holding facility clothing is always slightly too large, designed by its sizing to make the body inside it feel anonymous, interchangeable part of a category rather than a person with a name and a daughter in a Walmart bag on the back seat of a car that was currently being processed for forfeiture. When the heavy iron door closed, the sound it made was not just a sound. It was a change in the quality of the air, which became stiller and more final, and the hum of the fluorescent tube overhead became the loudest thing in the room. Marcus stood facing the door running calculations. Devon sat on the bench and looked at his hands. After a while, Devon looked up and asked Marcus what the lion's name was. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said Aaliyah hadn't named it yet. That was the plan. He'd bring it home, and she could look at it for as long as she needed and name it whatever she wanted because that was her part of this, and he was going to make sure she got to do it herself. Devon nodded slowly, looking back at his hands. Then he said, "That was a good plan." Then he was quiet. Marcus sat down on the bench beside him. He looked at Devon. He said he needed his phone call. Mercer brought Marcus out for the phone call at 3:14 a.m. with the energy of a man who is enjoying a specific kind of power. The power of allowing something of being the gatekeeper between a man and his one legitimate option. He leaned against the booking desk with his arms crossed and made a comment about the hour about who Marcus expected to call at 3 in the morning. A lawyer, a bail bondsman, someone who would take one look at the charges and realize how deep the hole was. Marcus picked up the handset of the corded desk phone without responding to any of this. He dialed a 10-digit number from memory. No hesitation, no searching, no consulting any piece of paper. The number was stored in him the way all essential things are stored past the layer of consciousness where you have to retrieve things down in the layer where your hands just know. The line was answered on the second ring. "Command Center, Lieutenant Commander Okafor." The voice was sharp and awake in the particular way of someone whose job requires them to be functional at any hour, and the professionalism in it was immediate and complete. "Ma'am, this is Chief Webb." Marcus kept his voice low and level and factual. "Carter and I are being held at the Denton County Sheriff's Department in Georgia. Fabricated charges resisting assault on an officer planted narcotics. We're both uninjured. Our CAC cards were confiscated at booking. The vehicle's systems were active the entire time." There was a pause of about half a second on the line, not hesitation, but the specific beat of a mind shifting from administrative to tactical. "Understood, Chief. Are you in immediate danger?" "Negative." "Stand fast. I'm waking the Admiral." "Copy that." He set the phone down. The entire call had lasted 43 seconds. Mercer was still leaning against the desk with his arms crossed, his expression carrying the smug certainty of a man who had watched this scene play out many times and knew how it ended. "What did your lawyer say?" Mercer asked. "That you're screwed." "I didn't call a lawyer," Marcus said, turning so Mercer could recuff his hands. "I called my boss." Mercer laughed a short dismissive sound and said something about the McDonald's night manager not having much pull in Denton County. He walked Marcus back to the cell and closed the door. The lock engaged with its familiar sound. Mercer went back to his desk and started filling out the civil asset forfeiture paperwork for the Tahoe, already thinking about the auction value, already mentally writing the next entry in his notebook. Rear Admiral James Thurston was asleep when the secure phone rang in a modest house in Virginia Beach, in a bedroom where his dress uniform hung on the back of the closet door because he had an early briefing and he was awake before the second ring in the way that 28 years of operational service had permanently rewired his body. Not gradually awake, not groggily reaching for the phone, but completely and immediately awake, sitting up the handset, already in his hand. On the nightstand, reading glasses, a half-finished biography of Thurgood Marshall with the spine cracked at page 211 and a glass of water. On the dresser, a photograph of himself at 24 in BUD/S gear, lean and young in the specific way of people who have just survived something that almost stopped them standing beside a man named Terrence Osee, who had died in Mosul in 2004, and whose name Thurston had never stopped carrying. Lieutenant Commander Okafor was precise and fast. She gave him the situation in under 60 seconds, location, names, charges, status, and 3 words at the end, cameras were active, that shifted the entire geometry of what was happening. He asked 2 questions. Were they injured? No. Did they have the footage? Yes. He was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he made 3 calls in rapid succession, each one answered on the first ring because of who he was and what the hour meant when he called it the FBI Regional Field Office Director in Atlanta, his JAG officer, and his aide. To the aide, he was brief, dress whites, car in 10 minutes, find out the arraignment time at Denton County Courthouse. Before leaving the bedroom, he paused at the dresser. He looked at the photograph himself at 24 beside Terrence Osei. Marcus Webb had that man's stillness, the same quality of calm that came not from the absence of danger, but from having made peace with it long before it arrived. Thurston picked up his cover, set it on his head, and walked out the door. The morning shift came in at 7 a.m., and Mercer was still there on overtime because he wanted to be present for the arraignment, and because there was a specific satisfaction in seeing the whole machine run from beginning to end. The stop, the booking, the court appearance, the forfeiture filing the bail set high enough to make the alternative obvious. He liked to see all the pieces connect. He always had. He had already filed the civil asset forfeiture paperwork on the Tahoe. He described the vehicle to the duty clerk with reference to its model year and estimated auction value doing the informal arithmetic. He always did the county's cut, the department's cut, the informal percentage that found its way into the notebook in his center console. He told the story of the stop to 2 morning deputies over bad coffee. It was already the 3rd retelling, and the 3rd was noticeably better than the first, tighter, more dramatic in the right places, with the discovery of the baggie presented as the natural conclusion of good instincts, rather than a man reaching into his own pocket on a dark highway while his back was turned. One of the deputies asked if the military ID thing was a problem. Mercer waved it off. He said he hadn't run them through the federal database, but the stop was clean, the report was solid, and Whitfield would take it from there. At 8:15 a.m., Mercer sat down at his desk with a fresh cup of coffee and pulled the small spiral notebook from his jacket pocket. He flipped to the most recent page. The last entry 4 days ago, $3,200, was still the most recent. He uncapped his pen. He wrote the date. He wrote Tahoe, Virginia plates. He wrote the number he expected the auction to produce. He looked at the column of entries going back 11 years, the neat rows of his own handwriting, and he felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has built something that works, who has found a system and stayed with it long enough that it runs without much effort anymore. He capped the pen. He put the notebook back in his pocket. He drank his coffee and thought that this was by every measure he used to evaluate such things a very good night's work. He had no way of knowing that the notebook in his pocket was going to be Exhibit A at his federal trial. He had no way of knowing that the 2 men he'd put in that cell had already set a series of events in motion that was now moving toward Denton County like weather silent, certain, and carrying everything it needed to arrive. At 9, he went down to check on his prisoners. He expected, as he always expected at this stage, to find men who had spent the night arriving at the practical understanding that cooperation was the fastest way out. He expected broken. He got upright, alert, and waiting. He closed the cell door without saying anything that time. Judge Gerald Whitfield arrived at the courthouse at 9:15 a.m. with coffee in a travel mug already in his robe, moving with the unhurried authority of a man in a building arranged around his preferences. His morning docket had 4 cases. The Webb Carter matter was 3rd. He'd read Mercer's report the night before and filed it under the category of things that would resolve themselves in the usual way. Behind his bench on the wall, where other judges hung their law degrees, was a framed certificate from the Denton County Sheriff's Department, Distinguished Service to Law Enforcement, given at the same dinner where his photograph with Mercer had been taken 6 months ago. Prosecutor Kyle Dunmore arrived 8 minutes late, scanned Mercer's report for 40 seconds, set it down, and started thinking about the bail number. He'd seen this template before. He knew what it produced. In the gallery, a handful of people had already taken seats. A woman in her 50s with a traffic citation, hands folded in her lap, trying not to look nervous. An older couple there for a relative's separate hearing, the husband with his arm around his wife's shoulder. and a local reporter named Sandra Merritt, who had almost called in sick that morning, who had decided at the last minute to come in because Tuesday mornings were slow and she was running out of ideas for the week. Sandra Merritt had a notebook open on her knee. She was expecting nothing. She would write about this morning for the rest of her career. They were brought across in transport chains, wrists connected to a waist belt, ankles hobbled to a 12-inch stride, and the chains were heavy and cold and clinked against the courthouse floor, with each step, in a way that was designed consciously or not, to announce the arrival of people who had been reduced to a category. The sound carried in the high-ceilinged lobby and preceded them into Courtroom B. Marcus took inventory of the room in the first 4 seconds, pressed tin ceiling with a water stain in the far corner single window, with Venetian blinds tilted 20 degrees off level 2 exits visible from the defense position. The bailiff standing near the far wall with the posture of a man doing a job he has stopped thinking about. Judge Whitfield at the bench reading something, not looking up. Prosecutor Dunmore at the table organizing papers. Mercer at the rail with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who has already decided how the next 30 minutes will go. Sandra Merritt was in the gallery, 3rd row, notebook open. Devon noticed her when they came in and noted the open notebook, and the noting of it was a small private thing that he did not show on his face. Despite the chains, both men walked with their backs straight and their heads level, and the combination of the transport hardware and the posture created a dissonance that several people in the room registered without being able to immediately name. They looked wrong in this setting, not because they didn't belong in a courthouse, but because they looked like they belonged somewhere considerably more serious than this one. Whitfield opened the case without looking up. The language was flat procedural, a morning checklist item, the charges read in the tone of a man who processes paperwork, not the tone of a man who understands that what is written on that paperwork was constructed on a dark highway by a man who reached into his own pocket while his back was turned. Marcus stated clearly in complete sentences that neither defendant had been afforded legal counsel. He said the charges were fabricated and that the arrest had involved an illegal search and planted evidence. Whitfield looked at him for the first time. He told Marcus in the specific tone of a judge who is accustomed to being the most powerful person in every room he occupies that in his courtroom, defendants do not speak unless spoken to, and they do not accuse officers of misconduct without proof. And he was setting bail at $250,000 each cash, and he suggested they find a bondsman or they would be sitting in county until their trial the following year. In the gallery, the woman with the traffic citation looked at the couple beside her. The husband met her eyes briefly, then looked away. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. Mercer at the rail allowed himself a small shift in posture. Not quite a smile, but the body language equivalent of a hand laid on a card that wins the pot. He had done this before. He would do it again. Dunmore added the forfeiture motion on the Tahoe. Whitfield raised his gavel. He never got to bring it down. The sound came first, a single heavy impact against both courtroom doors, simultaneously the kind of impact that communicated not aggression, but the controlled force of people who do not do things carelessly. And then both doors swung open with the momentum of that force and held there, and the gallery went silent in the specific way that rooms go silent. When the thing that everyone has been unconsciously braced for finally arrives and turns out to be real. The first thing visible in the doorway was the uniform. Not the man, the uniform, the specific white of navy dress whites that is not the white of ordinary white fabric, but brighter, crisper, the white of something maintained with obsessive care, because it represents something the white that catches even the dull fluorescent light of a Denton County courtroom and gives it back at a different quality entirely. Then the gold braiding on the sleeves, which communicated rank, and rank communicated a whole architecture of consequence that Mercer had not once considered when he reached into his cargo pocket on Highway 9. Then the ribbons on the chest, many of them a tapestry of service that the audience didn't need decoded because the quantity alone said everything that needed to be said, which was that the man wearing this uniform had been in places and done things that most people would not survive, and had come out the other side still standing and still showing up. Then the face. Rear Admiral James Thurston was 61 years old, and he looked it in the way that only certain people look their age, not diminished by it, but shaped by it, the way iron is shaped by hammer and fire into something that holds its form under pressure. His jaw was set. His eyes moved through the room and assessed it in the time it takes to draw a breath. When they found Marcus Webb at the defense table, something moved behind them. A tightening at the corner. A single, barely visible tension in the jaw muscle, the only visible sign of what a man who has led people into combat feels when he finds two of his people in chains in a county courthouse in Georgia. He walked down the center aisle. His shoes struck the hardwood with a sound that was precise and rhythmic and communicated that every step was intentional. Behind him, 4 FBI agents in dark suits moved with the peripheral synchronization of people who work together constantly. Their lead being Special Agent in Charge Naomi Voss, who had a badge case already open in her left hand, and the particular expression of a person who has reviewed the surveillance footage and has very clear opinions about what she saw. Mercer's transformation happened in 3 distinct stages. The first was confusion. Who is this? What is this? Who authorized this entrance? Where is this in any script he knows? The second was recognition, the stars on the shoulders, the bearing the FBI agents behind him, the fact that this was not a press event or an inspection or anything in the category of things Mercer knew how to manage. The third was the specific physical experience of a man who steps onto what he believes is solid ground and discovers it is not there a lurch that starts in the stomach and ends in the knees. The ground becoming air beneath him, his entire understanding of the next 30 minutes restructuring itself in the span of one heartbeat. The coffee cup in his hand had been there for the last 20 minutes. Mercer had forgotten it was there. He became aware of it now as a thing he was holding, and could not remember why, and his fingers went very slightly slack around it. Nobody's coming to save you boys out here. Your commanding officer isn't going to drive down from Virginia. Thurston stopped in the center aisle. He stated his name and rank in command. He stated who Marcus Webb and Petty Officer Devin Carter were. He stated why he was here. He did not raise his voice once. He didn't need to. Sandra Merritt was writing very fast. Special Agent in Charge. Naomi Voss moved to the front of the courtroom with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has prepared thoroughly and has no concerns about the material. She presented the situation in the clean, sequential language of federal law enforcement, the timeline of the stop the charges as filed, the nature of the evidence retrieved, and then the footage. The tablet screen was angled toward the bench and the footage played without preamble or explanation because it did not need any. What Whitfield and Dunmore and Mercer and the gallery and Sandra Merritt watched in high-definition color with clear synchronized audio was Deputy Clint Mercer conducting a thorough search of the Tahoe and finding nothing, and then walking to the front driver's side tire and then turning his back to the 2 men sitting in the wet grass, and then reaching into his own cargo pocket, and then turning back around with a small plastic baggie in his hand that had not been in that location before he turned around. The audio captured everything, every word from the highway. And then, at the 23-minute mark in Mercer's own voice, casual and certain, and completely unaware that it was being recorded. Nobody's coming to save you boys out here. Your commanding officer isn't going to drive down from Virginia. The courtroom was quiet for a moment after those words played. Then Thurston looked at Mercer. He said nothing. He simply looked at him the way a man looks at something he has fully assessed and fully understood, and does not need to say anything more about. And in the gallery, the woman with the traffic citation pressed her hand over her mouth, and the older husband put his arm tighter around his wife's shoulders, and Sandra Merritt stopped writing for exactly 3 seconds because she needed those 3 seconds to understand the full weight of what she had just witnessed. Then she started writing again faster than before. Kyle Dunmore's coffee cup was now simply in his hand. He was not drinking from it. He was not sure when he had picked it up. Whitfield lowered his gavel very slowly. He set it on the bench. He took off his reading glasses. He set them beside the gavel. The simple sequence of those gestures communicated the complete collapse of whatever he had believed himself to be holding 20 minutes ago. Agent Voss read the federal charges into the record of the Denton County Courthouse at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and she read them without hurry, because the unhurried pace was itself a message that this was not a reaction or an improvisation, but the conclusion of a process that had been moving toward this moment since 2:11 a.m. on Highway 9, and the conclusion was not in doubt. Title 18, United States Code Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Evidence tampering. Filing false official reports. And then last delivered in the same even tone as the others, federal kidnapping, and that Deputy Clint Mercer had unlawfully detained 2 active-duty military personnel under fabricated pretenses and held them against their will. The word kidnapping moved through the courtroom differently than the others. Mercer flinched at it, an involuntary small flinch but visible a physical acknowledgement that the word landed somewhere that the others hadn't, because kidnapping stripped away all the language of procedure and official capacity and said plainly what had actually happened on that highway. 2 FBI agents moved in from either side. Mercer did not resist. The fight was completely gone. He held his hands out, not in cooperation exactly, but in the way of a man whose body has arrived at an understanding before his mind has, and the steel clicked around his wrists. It was the same brand and model of handcuffs he carried in the field, and the sensation of the cold edge against his own wrists, the bite of the ratchet going 1 click tighter than necessary, because that is how federal agents apply handcuffs to men who have planted evidence and filed false reports with the full authorized force of an arrest that is entirely justified, arrived with the full weight of every time he had put that sensation on someone else without once thinking about what it felt like from the other side. When they turned him around, he looked back at the courtroom. Marcus Webb was watching him. Devin Carter was watching him. The older couple from the gallery were watching him. The woman with the traffic citation was watching him. Her hands still folded in her lap, but differently now. Not the folded hands of a nervous person, but the folded hands of a person who has witnessed something they will describe to people for the rest of their lives. Sandra Merritt was watching him. He looked at Marcus. Marcus did not look away. Marcus did not say anything, did not change his expression, did not perform anything at all, just held Mercer's gaze with the same steady attention he had held it with on the highway, the attention of a man who has been doing the exact right thing throughout, and does not need to announce it. Voss turned from Mercer to the bench without adjusting her tone. She informed Judge Whitfield and Prosecutor Dunmore that a sealed federal warrant had been issued for the complete audit of all traffic arrests, civil asset forfeiture proceedings, and plea agreements processed through Denton County courts over the previous 15 years. Both men were named as subjects of an active federal racketeering investigation. She asked them not to leave the state. Whitfield picked up his reading glasses from the bench. He held them in both hands, not putting them on, just holding them. After a moment, he set them back down. The Distinguished Service Certificate on the wall behind him caught the light from the single courtroom window and reflected it at no one. Admiral Thurston walked to the defense table. The room went quiet in a different way, not the silence of shock, but the silence of recognition, of understanding that the thing that needed to happen was about to happen. He stopped in front of Marcus. For a moment neither man spoke, and the silence between them was not awkward, but full of 8 months in theater, and the phone call at 3 a.m, and the notebook in Mercer's center console, and the lion in the Walmart bag. All of it, and all of the things that would follow from here. Thurston said something brief and direct. Not congratulations, not praise, but recognition. The specific acknowledgement of one person by another who has been in the same places and understands what it costs to hold your ground when the ground beneath you is made of nothing. Marcus said he needed to get home. His daughter was waiting. Thurston nodded once as if this were the most reasonable and correct statement that had been made in this courtroom all morning, which it was. An FBI agent with a key came forward. The waist chain, first it dropped from Marcus's body with a weight that was disproportionate to its size, landing on the hardwood floor with a sound that felt conclusive. Then the ankle hobble. Then the wrist cuffs. And when they came off, the marks were their deep red lines pressed into the skin of both wrists, the exact signature of restraint applied too tightly and held too long. Thurston saw them. The muscle at the corner of his jaw moved once, tightened, and then went still. He said nothing. He had already said what needed to be said into a phone at 3:30 a.m., and everything since had been the consequence of that. Devon rubbed his wrists, standing up from the defense table. He looked at the transport chain lying on the floor for a moment, just looked at it the way you look at something that had control over you and now doesn't, and then stepped away from it and didn't look back. He turned to one of the FBI agents and asked quietly if someone could retrieve something from the impounded vehicle. The agent looked at Thurston. Thurston nodded. Devon didn't explain what he needed. The audience already knew. The federal sweep of the Denton County Sheriff's Department began within hours, and what the agents found in Mercer's office confirmed everything that had been until that morning a practice protected by its own invisibility. From the center console of his personal vehicle, recovered from the courthouse parking lot, the small spiral notebook. 212 entries in Clint Mercer's own handwriting spread across 11 years. Dollar amounts, dates, vehicle descriptions, no names. He had never once learned the names. 212 people who had driven down Highway 9 at the wrong hour and had been processed through a machine that was built to produce a specific outcome, regardless of the facts, and the machine had run smoothly and continuously for 11 years, because everyone who was supposed to stop it had either been part of it or had looked away. 212 families who had spent years wondering what justice was supposed to look like from where they were standing. Mercer was denied bail at his federal arraignment on the grounds that he posed a flight risk and a danger to the community language that had been used to justify impossible bail amounts for people who had never posed any danger to anyone. He was sentenced 6 months later to 14 years in federal prison. The notebook was Exhibit A. His attorney spent most of the trial arguing it was personal notes. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. In the federal holding facility while awaiting trial, Mercer was placed in protective custody. His cell was 8 feet by 10 feet. The bulb overhead was behind wire mesh. It smelled of the same industrial bleach as the Denton County holding cell, and the floor was the same cold concrete, and the door made the same sound when it closed. One evening, sitting on the steel bench in the particular stillness of a place where the windows are never opened, he pulled a pen from his jumpsuit pocket, the only writing instrument he had been allowed, and held it in his fingers for a long time. He thought about the notebook. He thought about the 212 entries. He thought about the fact that he could not remember if asked a single name of a single person he had put in any of those entries. Not one, not the couple from the casino, not the family from Florida, not the 2 men from Virginia. He had never needed to know their names. They were dollar amounts, they were dates, they were vehicle descriptions. He set the pen down. He looked at the wall. The wall had nothing to say to him. Whitfield was disbarred. Federal RICO charges, stripped of his pension. The Distinguished Service Certificate was removed from the courthouse wall by a federal evidence technician and placed in a brown paper evidence bag. Dunmore cooperated, lost his license, never practiced law again. Denton County faced a class action lawsuit brought by all 212 individuals named in the notebook. The settlement restructured the county's finances for the next decade and funded a legal clinic in the county seat that provided free representation to traffic stop defendants for the following 8 years. It was 11:40 a.m. When Marcus Webb and Devin Carter walked out of the Denton County Courthouse into the Georgia morning and the sun after the fluorescent lights of the cell and the courtroom was something else entirely warm and direct and without apology, and it took a moment to adjust in the way that your eyes always need a moment to adjust when you move from a long darkness into the real thing. Devin was carrying something. A Walmart bag retrieved from the Tahoe by the FBI agent Devin had asked, and inside it, the stuffed lion slightly grimy on the back left paw from being tossed onto the highway shoulder during a search, but intact, completely and entirely intact, the same as it had been when Marcus tucked it against the door at 11 p.m. in a Florida rest stop parking lot with Aaliyah's missing tooth grin already in his mind. Devin handed the bag to Marcus without a word. Marcus took it, looked inside, checked the lion, and then held the bag at his side. Thurston shook both their hands on the steps. His grip was the grip of a man who has shaken hands at funerals and at promotions and at the end of operations that could have gone differently, and who treats all of those moments with the same seriousness because he understands that all of them are the same kind of serious, just wearing different clothes. To Marcus, he said something about holding the line when the line was all there was. To Devin, he referenced something specific, a detail from a classified after-action report Devin had filed 2 years ago, a small observation Devin had written almost as a footnote, thinking nobody above his immediate chain would read it closely enough to notice. Devin looked at the Admiral. Thurston held his gaze for exactly 1 beat, then turned and walked to his waiting car with the unhurried purpose of a man who has many more things to do today and is already thinking about the next one. Sandra Merritt was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She asked if they were willing to speak on the record. Devin looked at Marcus. Marcus thought about it genuinely, not the performance of thinking, but the actual weighing of what it meant and what it was for and who it was for. Then he said yes. He said 2 things on the record quietly and without performance. Looking at Sandra Merritt, but speaking to something behind her. Speaking to everyone who had ever been on a road like Highway 9 at a bad hour, with out-of-state plates, and nothing to put against the machine except the truth. Everyone who had faced what he and Devin had faced, and had no OD fleet vehicle, and no footage uploading in real time, and no Admiral's phone number. Memorized everyone for whom the next morning had arrived without an Admiral walking through any doors. Sandra Merritt wrote it all down. The story she published 3 days later won an award. More importantly, it was one of the first pieces of reporting that brought the Denton County case to national attention, which eventually contributed to federal legislation on civil asset forfeiture reform, and which meant that the words Marcus said on those courthouse steps, quiet without performance for the people who hadn't been able to say them, were still doing work years after the morning they were spoken. Devin drove. Marcus's shoulder had been holding a tension for the last 9 hours that he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge while it was happening, because acknowledgement would have been a kind of softening, and softening was not available on the highway or in the cell or in the courtroom. And now that the situation was resolved and Devin was driving and the Georgia pines were giving way to South Carolina in the late morning light, he let it go, not dramatically, not with any gesture, just a long exhale and a settling of the shoulders that Devin noticed and chose not to comment on. They didn't talk about what had happened for the first hour. Devin had his legal pad on his lap, pen moving in the focused, steady way of a man for whom writing is not recreation, but something closer to breathing. The road looked completely different in daylight. It was the same road. At a rest stop in North Carolina, Marcus called Keisha. The call was short. He was okay, he was on the way. He would explain everything when he got there, and he had something for Aaliyah. When he hung up, he sat in the parked car for a full minute, not moving, just sitting with the particular quiet of a man who has held himself very tightly for a very long time, and is only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of what it cost. Then he told Devin they could go, and Devin started the engine without saying anything because Devin Carter understood the difference between what needed words and what didn't. South of the Virginia border, Devin looked up from the legal pad and read Marcus 2 lines. just two about hands that have held too many things and about the difference between what chains you and what you choose to carry. They were very good lines arrived at through the particular alchemy of a man who has been through something and found the words for it before the feeling fades. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said Devon should finish it. Devon said he already knew what to call it. He said the title quietly just for Marcus, and it was right in the way that the right things are. Right, which is that it couldn't have been anything else. They crossed into Virginia with the late afternoon light coming in low and warm through the windshield, and Marcus reached over and turned the radio on, and whatever the station was playing, they let it play. It was evening when Marcus pulled onto his street in Virginia Beach. The last light was going gold through the neighborhood trees, the kind of evening light that makes ordinary things look like they're worth keeping, and Keisha's car was in the driveway, and one light was on in the front room, and the house looked exactly the way it always looked when he came home, which was to say it looked like the thing he had been holding in the back of his mind through 8 months and one very long night as the reason for everything. He got out of the Tahoe with the Walmart bag under his arm. The lion was inside it, slightly grimy on the back left paw, otherwise perfect. He walked up the front path, and the door opened before he reached it. Aaliyah was 7 and fast, and had been listening for his car since Keisha told her he was coming, and she came through the door at full speed and hit him at his good shoulder, and he caught her, and held on his face in her hair. His eyes closed, his big scarred hands gentle on her back, the Walmart bag hanging from his wrist. Keisha was in the doorway. She looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who has held everything together alone and is now watching the thing she held it together for finally walk back up the path. She wouldn't cry in front of Aaliyah. That was a thing between the two of them understood without discussion, long settled. After a moment, Aaliyah leaned back and noticed the bag. She asked what was in it. Marcus set her down. He reached into the bag and pulled out the lion and held it out to her with both hands. She took it with the focused seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to genuinely important decisions, turning it over, looking at its face, considering. The left back paw was a little dirty. She didn't seem to mind. Marcus waited. Keisha waited. The evening light came through the open door and lay across the front porch in a long, warm rectangle. "What's his name?" Aaliyah asked, looking up. "That's yours," Marcus said. "You get to decide." She looked back at the lion. She was quiet for a long time, 10 seconds, maybe more, which is a very long time when you are 7, and your father just came home and is standing in front of you with his hands at his sides, just waiting like the only thing in the world he has to do is wait for you to be ready. Then she named him. Something simple and specific and exactly right. The kind of name a child arrives at through some logic that adults have forgotten how to access a name that fit the lion so perfectly. It seemed like it had always been his name and she had simply been the one to find it. Marcus looked at Keisha over Aaliyah's head. Keisha looked back at him. There were no words for this moment, and neither of them reached for any. His phone buzzed in his pocket. One text from Devon, a single word confirming he was home safe. The last item on the checklist completed the way Devon always completed things. Marcus put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up his daughter and the lion together and carried them both through the front door. Keisha followed them in. She reached back and pulled the door closed. Outside, the porch light stayed on for a moment longer, casting its small, warm circle on the empty path. Then Keisha's hand found the switch from inside, and the light went off, and the street was quiet, and the Georgia pines were 1,000 miles away and getting farther with every breath. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like and share it, because the Marcus Webbs of this world deserve to have their stories told. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. We'll see you there.